Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. I want you to picture yourself stepping out of your front door on a sweltering summer morning. It's July, 1518. The air is bone dry, the sun is just beating down on you, and the narrow, dusty streets of Strasbourg, France, feel absolutely suffocating. But on this specific morning, there's something incredibly unusual happening right in the middle of a cobblestone alleyway. A woman named Frau Troffea is moving. Now, she's not walking to the market, and she definitely isn't just waving to her neighbors. She is dancing. And what she's doing in that alleyway is about to set off literally one of the most thoroughly documented, deeply terrifying, and just downright bizarre medical mysteries in all of human history. Now, when we say she was dancing, we really need to throw out our modern associations with, joy or music or celebration. Frau Troffea was definitely not waltzing. She danced in this complete, heavy silence, broken only by the sound of her own gasping breath and her shoes just scraping against the rough stones. She was trapped in what was clearly an agonizing physical ordeal. People who were actually there described her movements as wildly erratic, jerky, and spasmodic. Remember, there were no pipes playing, no drums. She was just spinning, hopping, and shaking, completely pale, dripping with sweat, with this glassy, detached look in her eyes. And she just didn't stop. Hours passed, night fell, morning broke, and she was still moving. Her feet became swollen and started bleeding, yet her body relentlessly kept going for nearly a week before she finally collapsed from just utter exhaustion. So yeah, this wasn't a dance, it was a living nightmare. So to even begin to understand how this strange event ignited, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of the people of Strasbourg at the time. The whole decade leading up to 1518 was just a relentless, non-stop series of disasters. The citizens were basically trapped in a psychological pressure cooker. They had barely survived these freezing winters and ruined crops, only to immediately face historic highs in the price of bread. You had starving farmers literally begging at the city gates. And on top of all that grinding poverty, deadly epidemics were tearing through the population. We're talking leprosy, smallpox, the sweating sickness, and a terrifying, brand new, totally incurable disease, syphilis. The sheer amount of trauma these people were enduring on a daily basis was absolutely staggering. But actually, physical suffering was only half the equation here. Back in the 16th century, religion was the ultimate lens through which every single event was processed. The people of Strasbourg lived in a world of profound spiritual terror. If crops failed or if someone got sick, well, it wasn't just bad luck, it was divine punishment. They honestly believed the air around them was crowded with invisible demons and these highly temperamental saints who could just curse them on a whim. So, when Frau Troffea began her silent, agonizing dance, her traumatized neighbors didn't look at her and see a medical emergency. They saw a curse. And that fear, it acted like a spark in a powder keg. Within days, the dancing started to spread like wildfire. First, another woman joined Frau Troffea, then a man. By the end of the first week, over 30 people were dancing alongside her. And within a single month, the crisis had swelled to a staggering 400 citizens. 400! Men, women, children. They were all seized by this irresistible, unexplainable urge to just violently move their bodies. The city's public markets, the narrow alleys, even the Grand Cathedral itself were suddenly filled with people hopelessly trapped in this silent, frenzied trance. The brutal reality of this was that this mass event was pushing the human body completely past its biological limits. The dancers were literally begging for help, crying out to God to make their legs stop, but they physically couldn't. And the physical toll was devastating. They were suffering from severe dehydration, massive lactic acid buildup, and blistered, bleeding feet. And as the August heat peaked, the horror escalated even further. The weak and the elderly began dropping dead right there in the streets from fatal heart attacks, strokes, and heat exhaustion. The entire city was totally paralyzed, the economy ground to a halt. And, as you might guess, the authorities were in full-blown panic mode. Which brings us to part one, the bizarre cures in diagnosing hot blood. Okay, so the city council and local university physicians started holding emergency meetings. I mean, they were dealing with an unprecedented medical whodunit, and they desperately needed a solution before the entire city just collapsed. Now, at the time, doctors viewed human biology through the lens of ancient Greek and Roman theories, specifically this concept of the four humors. Basically, they believed human health required a perfect balance of four internal fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. After examining the dancers, the physicians officially ruled out cold-blooded demonic possession. Their official professional medical diagnosis, hot blood. They confidently concluded that the victim's blood had somehow overheated, creating this hyperactive fever in the brain. And based on that terribly flawed diagnosis, the council came up with a cure that failed spectacularly. Their logic was essentially, well, if the blood is too hot, the victims just need to sweat it out. The city's official response was, quite literally, a dance-it-out protocol. No joke. They constructed these massive wooden stages right in the middle of the public markets. They hired professional musicians, drummers, pipers, horn players to blast loud, fast music around the clock. They even went as far as paying healthy strongmen to physically prop up the exhausted victims so they wouldn't stop moving. But, as you can imagine, instead of curing anyone, this just turned the plague into a massive, highly organized public spectacle. It acted like a powerful magnet for a highly fragile population, and it ended up attracting hundreds of brand new victims. So, by late August, the death toll was rising, the streets were in absolute chaos, and the council finally realized they had made a colossal mistake. They frantically tore down all the wooden stages, fired the musicians, and issued a total ban on all public dancing and music. Pivoting entirely away from medical science and going straight for spiritual intervention, they declared, okay, scratch that, this isn't a disease of hot blood at all. It's the wrath of St. Vitus. Their new plan? A desperate, agonizing march up into the mountains to a shrine dedicated to the saint, begging for his forgiveness. They loaded the exhausted dancers into these rough wooden carts and hauled them up to the shrine in Saverne. There, the priests performed a very specific ritual. They guided the shaking victims around the altar, sprayed them with holy water, and anointed them with oil. And then came the twist. The priests placed bright red leather shoes, marked with tiny holy crosses, directly onto the feet of the dancers. And incredibly, almost miraculously, the cure actually worked. Within days of receiving these red shoes, the trances broke, their exhausted legs finally relaxed, and the dancers slept. The plague was over. But it left behind a mystery that would puzzle historians for centuries to come. All right, moving on to part 2, the false suspect, ergotism. For decades, the absolute dominant scientific explanation for all of this was just simple food poisoning. See, during wet seasons, a toxic black fungus called ergot can grow on rye grain. And if you bake that contaminated rye into your bread, you are essentially consuming ergotamin, which is a really powerful chemical precursor to LSD. This causes deeply terrifying symptoms, violent muscle spasms, severe shaking, and incredibly vivid, frightening hallucinations. At a quick glance, this sounds like the perfect suspect for a whole town full of people convulsing in the streets. But let's be real here. When we actually compare the symptoms side by side, the ergotism theory completely falls apart. Look at the reality of ergotism. It severely restricts blood flow to your limbs. If you eat enough of it to hallucinate for a week, your fingers and toes literally turn black, develop gangrene, and start to fall off. The pain is uncoordinated and agonizing. Now look back at the Strasbourg dancers. They were performing high-endurance, rhythmic leaping for days on end. I mean, think about it. A victim with dying, gangrenous limbs, curled up in agonizing pain, could never survive a week-long dance marathon. So for sure, food poisoning is completely out. Which brings us to part 3, the true culprit, mass psychogenic illness. The true culprit shifts this whole mystery away from a physical toxin and points it toward a deeply human phenomenon known as mass psychogenic illness, or mass hysteria. Now, this is a very real, well-documented psychiatric condition, and it's absolutely vital to understand that these people in 1518 were not just faking it. When the human mind is pushed past its absolute breaking point by trauma, it can enter a dissociative state. The brain literally hijacks the physical body to protect itself from reality, causing genuine physical symptoms that spread through a community like a contagion. But it spreads not through germs, but through sheer psychological pressure. And Strasbourg fits this diagnosis perfectly. They had the 3 perfect ingredients. First, extreme traumatic stress from starvation, poverty, and disease. Second, a deeply ingrained cultural belief in the curse of St. Vitus. And third, social contagion. When Frau Troffea broke down under the stress, her neighbors didn't see someone having a mental health crisis. Their own traumatized brains saw the curse manifesting in real time. The visual suggestion was so overwhelmingly powerful that it triggered a massive chain reaction, forcing their own bodies to enter the exact same dissociative trance. And you know what? This brilliantly explains the mystery of the red shoes. A psychological disease requires a psychological cure. The whole hot blood state strategy didn't work because it just added to the visual stress and validated everyone's panic. But the holy cure? By traveling up to that shrine, praying, and wearing those specially blessed red shoes, the victims' minds were given a powerful symbolic release. They truly, deeply believed they were saved from the curse. And once the mind believed it was cured, the brain released its hijack of the body, and the physical symptoms simply vanished.
And finally, part 4. Could it happen today?
It's really easy to look back at the 16th century and just assume we are way too advanced for something like this to happen now. But mass psychogenic illness is a fundamental feature of the human brain, and it absolutely still happens. Take 1962, the Tanganyika laughter epidemic. It literally forced schools to close after hundreds of students who were dealing with the extreme societal stress of their country's newly gained independence began laughing uncontrollably for months. They were suffering pain and fainting, but unable to stop. And look at the 2020s. During the extreme isolation and anxiety of global lockdowns, neurologists documented teenagers all around the world developing sudden, involuntary physical tics. It turned out their stressed brains were subconsciously copying movements they were watching on social media videos. It is the exact same psychological mechanism as the 1518 contagion, just updated for the digital age. The core takeaway here is that our brains are highly connected social organs. We mirror each other's language, we mirror fashion and behavior, and when we are pushed to the absolute brink by stress, terror, and exhaustion, our brains can literally copy each other's physical suffering. There is a direct, empathetic line connecting a starving 16th century peasant in a cobbled street to a modern anxious teenager just scrolling on a smartphone today. The dancing plague of 1518 reminds us of the terrifying, profound connection between our minds and our bodies. It proves that when the burdens of life become too heavy, our bodies will find a way to express that pain, even if it means dancing until we collapse. So I'll leave you with this final question. As our modern world faces its own extreme stressors, could a mass psychogenic illness of this scale happen again in our lifetime?
Please like and subscribe.